When you write an argumentative paragraph, there are 7 parts that you need to include, so we're going to look at how to organize those. You have claim, example, evidence, commentary, counterclaim, rebuttal, and a concluding sentence. So we're just going to go step by step. The first part is your claim. This is your argument, and it should be specific and clear. Compelling means that it's interesting. Debatable means that someone can argue against it, and defensible means it can be supported. It should not be a fact. If your claim is a fact, you're not writing an argument. You're writing an expository piece. There's no way you can possibly argue with a fact. And an easy sentence starter to use for your claim is who should or should not blank because blank. So here's an example of that about the Dakota Access Pipeline. So mine says, the Dakota Access Pipeline should not have been built because it encroaches upon the lives of the already displaced Native Americans for the benefit of big oil companies. So that tells me the rest of that paragraph is going to focus on how it hurts the Native Americans and it benefits big oil companies. And I'm tying that to the government's role in it. So next is your example. So your example needs to get more specific about your claim, and some sentence starters for that are for example. Specifically, one major problem is your example. The most important thing about your example is that it should be specifically related to your claim. You don't just give another reason than you stated in your claim. So if you're writing about cell phones should be allowed in schools for educational purposes, then your example is going to give one of those educational purposes. So here's my example, same claim. And I said, for example, the government has already stolen land, resources, and culture from the Native American tribes. The Sioux tribe has been reserved to this minuscule piece of land, and now the government wants to compromise that land. So here I give a specific reason about how the pipeline encroaches upon the lives of the already displaced Native Americans. And I'm tying in the government too because the government has approved that pipeline to be built. Next is your evidence. This is incredibly important to include. You have to use valid, recent, and reliable information. If you don't, why should anyone believe you? And then you have to authorize that. So who said it? If you don't do this, again, no one's going to believe you. You could have just made it up. So an easy way to start the sentence is according to, and you want to give as much information about your source as possible. So give their name, the title if they have one, so a doctor maybe. If there's an organization they're tied to, such as a university or a hospital, the article's name, the publication source, meaning is it a website, is it a book, where did it come from? And again, your evidence has to support what you claimed and gave an example about. Everything has to be tied together in this paragraph. So I've given my claim and my example. Here's my evidence. According to CNN, the tribe says the pipeline will damage and destroy sacred sites. So I gave my source. That's all the information that I had available. And then I quoted it word for word. Notice the punctuation as well. Next, after your evidence, you always have to say something about that evidence, and that's called the commentary. You have to say how it ties to your claim and answers the question, why does this matter? This is not a summary. This is the biggest mistake people make. You don't just restate what your evidence said. So some questions to help you develop that is, what does this prove? What does this support? Or what implications arise because of this? So here's my example. Remember, my evidence was, according to CNN, the tribe says the pipeline will damage and destroy sacred sites. And here's my commentary. The tribe has already lost so much, and the pipeline will further destroy their cultural values so oil billionaires can get richer. Notice how I have talked specifically about my evidence, and talking about the oil billionaires ties it back to that claim, how it's helping them and destroying the Indian land. Next is your counterclaim. You always have to address the other side of the issue. So what's the other side of the argument? Here you want to play devil's advocate. So if you had to argue the other side, what would your reasoning be? You have to, again, relate this to your claim. Don't just come up with a totally different reason why other people might argue against the pipeline should be built. You have to tie it to what you claimed. So I need to tie it to that it should not be built because of this, this, and this. An easy sentence starter is, many may argue. Some proponents or opponents of blank argue that blank, or critics of blank argue that blank. So here's my example of my counterclaim. I said, many opponents of the pipeline argue that the pipeline is on private property and therefore is not destroying any of the sacred sites. So I argued the opposite. I said, my claim was that it should not have been built because it encroaches upon the Native American lives, but then I'm doing the direct opposite in my counterclaim, saying that people are arguing that the pipeline is on private property, so it can't be destroying their sacred sites. Notice, too, that I have used some wording that I've used in other pieces of the paragraph. The word opponents means those against it. Next, after your counterclaim, you can't just leave your counterclaim there all by itself without arguing against it, or you're contradicting yourself, and then no one's going to buy into what you're saying. So, you argue against what the counterclaim says in your rebuttal. So why are you right and why is the other side wrong? Some sentence starters for that are, however, these people fail to acknowledge why this may be true, and there's many others you can use, but those are some simple ones. So here's my rebuttal. Remember, my counterclaim was, many opponents of the pipeline argue that the pipeline is on private property and therefore is not destroying any of the sacred sites. Notice how long my rebuttal is. Starting out, yours does not have to be this long, but it is best to go into as much detail as possible. I even kind of included 2 counterclaims within my rebuttal, so here's my rebuttal. However, according to Chris White, writer for the Daily Caller News Foundation, the tribe claims that the land is theirs under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. Clearly, the government is trying to once again benefit while taking something away from the Native American tribes. Many people are going to argue that a treaty over 150 years old is no longer relevant, but I disagree. These protections are the only thing that can stop the government from completely exterminating native land, so once they overlook a treaty, it becomes a slippery slope. So notice how much information I gave there and how I tied everything back to my original claim about how it's hurting the Native Americans and benefiting big oil companies, and how it's been a kind of a pattern of behavior since the beginning of America. Lastly is your concluding sentence, and this is just wrapping your paragraph up. You tie all your ideas together. Always come back to your original claim and take into account what you've discussed in the rest of the paragraph. So some of your sentence starters can be clearly, consequently, or as a result. So my concluding sentence says, clearly the Dakota Access Pipeline is causing more problems for the Native Americans, and construction on it should immediately be halted. I've gone back to my original claim that the pipeline is causing problems for Native Americans and that construction needs to be stopped.